John Marciari, just back from a Morgan study trip last night, has flown in to speak with us today. He is the Charles W. Engelhard Curator and Head of the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, a position he has held since 2014. A specialist particularly in Italian and Spanish art of the 16th and 17th centuries, he has published on many aspects of artistic practice. His recent publications include the exhibition and book Drawing in Tintoretto's Venice, the catalog Italian Renaissance Drawings at the Morgan and Library and Museum, co-authored with Rhoda Idle-Porter, and the related exhibition Invention and Design, Early Italian Drawings at the Morgan, as well as Art of Renaissance Rome, Artists and Patrons in the Eternal City. He was the general editor of A Demand for Drawings, 5 Centuries of Collectors and Collecting Drawings, and also contributed both an introduction and an essay on Janos Schultz to that volume. In connection with his position at the Morgan, Dr. Marciari is head of the Morgan Drawings Institute, a research center focused on the study of drawings from all periods. He serves on the editorial board of the journal Master Drawings. Please welcome Dr. Marciari.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Louisa. In traditional histories of Italian Renaissance art, Giorgio Vasari might be described not only as the first art historian, but also the first major collector of drawings. We know now that neither of those descriptions is strictly true. With regard to the collecting of drawings, for example, the work of Evelyn Carrot, Peter Windows, and others have made us familiar with figures such as Felice Feliciano, that quintessential Renaissance man of Verona, a humanist, antiquarian, poet, and collector, whose will of 1466 discussed his drawings collection, and whose collector's mark, even if often effaced, can be recognized and allows us to identify sheets that were in his collection, among them works by Stefano da Verona. Other early collectors include Antonio Badile the Younger, who before his death around 1510 had managed to assemble the group of drawings that were long part of the now dismembered Badile album. They and others all predated Vasari, who was only born in 1511. Vasari still stands as a pivotal figure, however, in a distinct kind of drawing collecting, and it was precisely his scholarly, historical interests that can be said to have led him there. Specifically, it seems that Vasari can particularly be credited with establishing a mode of collecting not only autonomous drawings, fancy portrait heads, and relatively finished compositional studies, but also scrappy preparatory sketches, works that were generally not understood by their creators to have inherent pictorial values, but which were instead the functional working material of the studio. The working drawing, the jotting down of a quick compositional idea, or a study made to work out the pose of a figure, was inherently a different sort of object. Now I'm using this sheet from the National Gallery to stand in for Vasari, although whether it is in fact a mount by Vasari or by Niccolo Gaddi, who later on the album, is a question still to be considered further, as Andrew Mora has demonstrated. The previous example with a mount by Zucchi is certainly from the original libro degli Segni. Now in contrast to these working drawings, paintings, of course, were made to commission, or with the intention that they would be sold and shown. Worked up compositional drawings, moreover, might be required by contracts, or else just shown to the patron as part of a conventional habit. These drawings were thus made with the intention or expectation that they would be shown, and they became, naturally, collectible. The distinctions between compositional modelli and autonomous drawings made as an end in themselves, thus easily blur. The working sketch, or figure drawing, however, was a different beast. For the most part, painters of the 15th and earlier 16th centuries only reluctantly surrendered such materials to collectors, both because they were part of a studio's working material, and also because painters did not understand them as works demonstrating their full abilities. By the latter part, or by the middle of the 17th century, this had changed. And it's this process of cleaning out the workshop, the ways both practical and theoretical in which preparatory drawings became collector's material, that I'd like to discuss today. Now, it's an art historical commonplace of sorts that one inherent aspect of the Italian Renaissance is that the process of sketching came to be valued as a figment of artistic genius. The sketch, that is, was understood to represent a moment in which an artist seized upon inspiration and, in an almost godlike act, brought a new creation into being. Elements of this belief can be found in Leon Battista Alberti's treatise on painting, and it's an historical phenomenon with which Leonardo da Vinci is particularly associated, thanks in no small part to Gombrich's famous essay on Leonardo's method of working out compositions. And yet, even if theorists and artists began to think this way by the early or mid-15th century, actual collecting practices seem to have lagged behind. Take, for example, the drawings in this part of the current exhibition of early Italian drawings at the Morgan. These are all drawings that can, for one or another reason, be considered works made for collectors. They're all highly finished. A number of them, such as these two sheets by Francesco Francia, are on parchment, a costly material not used for casual sketching, but rather for more formal works that were seen as collector's items. Highly finished portrait drawings are a similar class of object. And one of the other drawings in this part of the show, which we've seen already, it's this sketch there, was even part of the Badile album. And indeed, most of the Badile drawings were similarly pictorial. As mentioned already, compositional drawings often fall into the same category, and the line between the preparatory sketch and the autonomous drawing can blur. Bartolomeo Montagna's Drunkenness of Noah, for example, is shown in the same section of the Morgan exhibition. On the one hand, this is on parchment. It makes use of a fancy blue wash seen in several other drawings on that wall, and the yellow streaks are the residue of a very old varnish applied to the drawing, presumably by a collector who treated it as akin to a painting and hung it on the wall. On the other hand, Montagna produced a Drunkenness of Noah in 1483 for the Scuola di San Marco in Venice, and there's some evidence that this is a drawing that he had to show to his patrons as part of the contractual approval process. Similarly, some of the most impressive early drawings to survive, works such as Taddeo Gaddi's presentation of the Virgin at the Louvre, connected to his frescoes in the Marciari chapel in Santa Croce, or Ceni's Ser Francesco Ceni's Arrest and Martyrdom of San Miniato, probably related to lost frescoes done for the town of San Miniato west of Florence, a sheet also in the Morgan exhibition. These are connected to known painting projects. Some scholars believe them to have been contract drawings shown to the patron, others that they were ricordi of paintings. But in any case, they must have been made for some special purpose. They're highly finished, and to a degree that went beyond anything normally required for the presentation of a painting, for the preparation of a painting, especially drawing in grisaille for paintings that are in color. Other considerations must have been at work. The truly amazing survival, however, is not of the highly finished work, as rare as such things are, but rather of a sheet like this one. And I apologize that it's difficult to see, but it is Spinello Aretino's sketch, that is, a working compositional drawing, a trial run, modified in the final work for his frescoes in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, done around 1408. And here's an image of the fresco. I realize it's not very clear and has big damage. You're going to have to trust me when I say that there are changes from the drawing to the final painting. Now, as a marker of just how rare such a thing is, consider that it has been identified multiple times as the earliest working sketch for an extant painting. It seems striking to me that nothing predates the beginning of the 15th century. We don't have a drawing and an extant painting before this example from 1408. And in this case, it was surely an accidental survival, and it lasted because the paper was reused, and Spinello's son Pari Spinelli made an elaborate figure drawing on the back, something that would have had a continuing role in the working of the studio, and was probably the reason the sheet was saved. The back was long glued down and then peeled off only in the 70s, so it is perhaps even more difficult to see than the recto. Return to the predominant pattern of collecting before Vasari, though, what we see in the Feliciano and Badile collections, or in the section of the Morgan exhibition dedicated to collectors' drawings, can be confirmed by other examples. Take the case of Gabriele Vendramin, seen here in Titian's great votive portrait. The notes made by Marcantonio Mechil when he visited the collection, a will drawn up before Vendramin's death in 1552, and posthumous inventories from the 1560s allow us to reconstruct his holdings to a certain extent. We know, for example, that he owned Jacopo Bellini's drawing book, now in the British Museum, as well as the paired portrait drawings by Giovanni Bellini and Vittore Bellignano, now at Chantilly. What's much more surprising is that Vendramin had Roman works as well as Venetian, including a number of fancy compositional drawings from Raphael in his workshop, among them the appearance of Saints Peter and Paul to Attila and Pope Leo, and the Adoration there right from the Louvre. There was obviously a trade in such drawings that went far beyond the artist's immediate circle in Rome. But turning to Rome, we can also cite the collection of Fulvio Orsini, which has been reconstructed by Michel Ochman and others. Orsini served as librarian and antiquarian to the Farnese cardinals, but he built a collection of his own as well. Although he was a scholar, his drawings were, typically for the time, shown framed, mixed in with paintings, and conceptually akin to them, not kept in albums or portfolios as rare historical objects. Again, these were a combination of autonomous drawings, highly finished compositional models, and cartoons or cartoon fragments. Orsini's drawings included Michelangelo's Fall Phaeton, probably the one that was later in the Farnese collection and is now at Windsor. He was, after all, Alessandro Farnese's librarian, and his collection was later merged into Farnese's own, as well as a study by Giulio Clovio after Michelangelo's crucifixion. Drawings taken to this level of refinement were inherently precious objects. Similarly, exceptions to the general rule of preferring pictorial compositional drawings might be made for treasures by the greatest artists, Michelangelo or Raphael, especially in the decades after the latter's death. Orsini also seems to have owned Raphael's study of Aeneas and Anchises for the Fire of the Borgo, drawing now in the Albertina. His Roman contemporary, Antonio Troncarelli, formed an analogous collection in the latter half of the Cinquecento. It was heavily weighted towards works by Troncarelli's contemporaries and included compositional drawings, such as Primo del Vaga's presentation of the Virgin, now at the Met, or Salviati's Allegory of Peace in the British Museum. Highly finished drawings in the Michelangelesque mode, like those by Clovio that we've just seen, these kinds of drawings, in which a figure was carried to such a degree of refinement that it became an end in itself, also began to appear in collections in this moment. Examples in Troncarelli's holdings included Daniele da Volterra's Dido, recently acquired by the Met. While many of Troncarelli's drawings were framed and hung on the wall like those of Orsini, there were 150 more kept in an album. The album was not, however, organized according to any historical principles. One page had drawings by Salviati, Raphael, Beccafumi, and Primo del Vaga on it, while another juxtaposed sheets by Perino, Raffaele da Montelupo, Perugino, and Salviati. Most pages of the album had a single drawing on them, but those pages with multiple drawings also indicate that Troncarelli was willing to acquire smaller sketches of some sort. But there's a body of evidence that suggests that a distinction between the collectible finished drawing and the working sketch persisted, and it was one maintained not only by the collectors, but by the artists themselves. We can learn this, for example, from the surviving correspondence that documents the efforts of Niccolo Gaddi, one of the most ambitious drawing connoisseurs of the Cinquecento, to build a collection. He acquired Giorgio Vasari's famous Libro dei Disegni and seems to have expanded it greatly, building an enormous collection of drawings for which he employed a network of agents in Rome, Venice, Bologna, and elsewhere. These are pages which Andrew Mora has convincingly argued to be the work of Gaddi and his framers and not part of Vasari's original Libro, in part because they have the falcons here and the falcon head there that are part of Gaddi's coat of arms. Like Vasari, but like few collectors before the 17th century, Gaddi collected according to historical principles, and he was distinctly interested in working sketches, something that seems at times to have baffled even the artists whom Gaddi or his agents approached. In 1581, for example, Gaddi wrote to Francesco Bassano, requesting drawings by Francesco and also by his father Jacopo. Bassano, apologies for that slide on the left. Bassano first apologized and then demurred. If these drawings are not to your excellency's taste, you must excuse me, because we, the Bassano family, have never drawn very much, nor have we made a profession of drawing. But certainly, we have employed every kind of study in order to produce works of art, which we have wanted to realize in the best possible way. What does this mean? We employ every kind of study, but we have never drawn very much? It could be suggested that this was a matter of a Venetian responding to the perceived differences between Venetian and Tuscan art, already well established in the literature of the time. In likewise fashion, a few years earlier, the Bolognese dealer Ercole Bassi had written to Gotti from Venice, expressing frustration with the difficulty of finding drawings there. Bassi wrote, "I'm sending your excellency 4 pieces, which don't satisfy me. Nonetheless, I'm sending them because I went to such difficulty to find them, the case being that these painters paint without drawing." But nonetheless, he had the drawings to send, and as Bassano said, we have employed every kind of study. I think it was less a matter of finding drawings, but of finding drawings like those they expected Gotti would want. In support of this idea, we can look at the letters that Giovanni Antonio Dossio, the architect who served as Gotti's agent for collecting in Rome, he wrote about the search for drawings there in 1574, saying he was unsuccessful in his attempt to find drawings by Sebastiano del Piombo, and because Federico Zuccaro was out of the city, having left on his travels in the wake of the Porta Virtutis scandal, Dossio could not offer Gotti any drawings by Federico or Taddeo. The family workshop must have been closed up tight. The most telling line in the letter, though, relates to his attempt to get drawings by Girolamo Muziano. I show 2 typical Muziano drawings here. Both are from a few years later, both date to around 1578, but the point is that the artist was a beautiful, avid, active draftsman. And yet, Dossio wrote to Gotti, "Muziano gives us difficulty, not having things that satisfy, and wanting to send something good." I mean, I don't think drawing gets much better than these kind of red chalk sketches, but it was inconceivable that Muziano did not have drawings in the workshop, but he did not have the sort of disegno buono that he expected Gotti to want. That is, I believe, he did not have autonomous drawings or elaborate compositional drawings, because he didn't make those, or at the very least, he was not willing to give them up. And even a generation later, we find Guercino writing to his patron, Don Antonio Ruffo, in 1650, explaining that he could not send Ruffo any drawings because, owing to poor health, Guercino now had to paint directly to the canvas. And yet, at that very moment, Guercino was painting a full-length canvas of Endymion for Ruffo, perhaps using this drawing at the Met as his model. Now, even if the drawing was a decade or more old by 1650, which seems to me likely on the basis of style, the point is that Guercino was not going to surrender this or any other sketch to Ruffo. As in this case, Guercino often returned to his earlier drawings, sometimes using an older study of a particular subject as the starting point for a new painting, and these studies remained part of the studio working material for decades after his death. For some artists, it might have been a case of misunderstanding what the collectors wanted, but for others, like Guercino, or I think Muziano, it seems a matter of deliberate evasiveness. Against this pattern of exchange with the collectors, we must weigh another phenomenon, the desire for an artist to have his workshop pass largely intact, with all the working drawings, to his heirs, especially as long as the artist had an heir who was himself a painter. To continue with a look at Guercino, we can note that some of the painter's drawings made it out into the world during his lifetime, but he left the overwhelming majority of his working studies to his 2 nephews, Benedetto and Cesare Gennari, who were themselves painters. Benedetto died without heirs. The drawings passed to the younger Cesare's sons, Filippo Antonio and Gianfrancesco, and only after their death, 3 generations after Guercino's own, did Gianfranco's son Carlo begin selling off the family drawings in earnest, with one large group passing through the hands of the Bolognese dealer Francesco Forni to the Englishman John Bouverie, and the rest being acquired by Richard Dalton for the English Royal Collection. It was long after Guercino's death that his drawings with the familiar and distinctive Casa Gennari mounts, seen here, though whether they were added by the Gennari, Francesco Forni the dealer, or Bouvry remains an open question, but it was only long after Bertino's death that these were added and the drawings became collector's items themselves. To take an earlier example, we can consider Jacopo Tintoretto. With his death in 1594, his workshop passed to his elder son Domenico, who continued operating the studio until his own death in 1635. It then passed to Sebastiano Casera, a German painter who was a member of the studio and who married Domenico's sister Ottavia. Notwithstanding the fact that Ottavia was already 60 years old at the time of the marriage, and that Casera was some 16 years younger than her. According to the terms of Domenico's will, Casera was to be given, among other things, a bust of Vitellius, the model for so many drawings from Tintoretto's studio, a statue and 2 torsos, all the drawings that Casera had done as a student in Domenico's workshop, and 150 sketches of male figures and 50 of female figures, in addition to the pigments, brushes, and a porphyry stone still in the studio. In other words, this heir, by virtue of marriage, received all the working material in the studio, including most of the drawings. But Domenico's younger brother, Marco, who was no longer an artist, was to get the sketches and paintings of Jacopo, the so-called disegni buoni. Now, I think this distinction between the good drawings by Jacopo and the working material of the studio is an important one. Famously, almost none of Jacopo's compositional drawings survive, the great Berlin sketch being one notable exception. And it is my suspicion that the rest of them passed to Marco as the disegni buoni and were somehow subsequently lost. These accidents happen. The figure drawings, however, remained in the workshop. Leopoldo de' Medici, to whom I'll return, acquired about 150 of them late in his life, presumably using his agents to buy them from the aged Casera. We also know that in 1678, Antonio Saurer, an agent acting on behalf of the Marquis del Carpio, visited Casera, who sold him further remnants of the studio, including all the compositional drawings by Domenico Tintoretto that are now in the British Museum. Indeed, the extant drawings by Jacopo in his workshop seem mainly to have been sold off in 2 large groups: the Medici set, now in the Uffizi, and a second set that bears the inscription Giacomo Tintoretto or G. Tintoretto, added by an unknown collector. It's not clear whether these were bought by Saurer or another agent, but most or all of this later group was subsequently in the collection of Joshua Reynolds. You see his collector's mark slightly cut off in the slide there at lower left, after which the group was broken up. These sheets are now scattered, and you find them in collections in England, the US, Vienna, Berlin, and elsewhere. We've also already heard about Gotti's attempt to buy drawings from the Bassano. Some 80 years later, in 1654, Leopoldo de' Medici's agent Paolo del Serra tracked down one Giovanni Domenico Biava, who was the heir and executor of Girolamo Bassano, a younger member of the family. Serra was able to send a group of drawings to Florence, although he noted that at least one of these was solo per discorso pittoresco, yet another sign that the workshop was yielding not elaborately finished studies, but rather working sketches. The bigger point in all this is that working drawings generally stayed together in a workshop as long as there was an heir to inherit them, and especially if there was an heir who was an artist. An explicit documentation of this is found in a passage, much quoted, from the will of Peter Paul Rubens, who explained that his drawings, both those he made and those by other artists which he had collected, were not to be sold until his youngest child was 18, and only then sold if none of his sons had become a painter and if none of his daughters had married one. Things get more complicated when there was no heir, or when the heir was not an artist. Federico Barocci, for example, gave some of his drawings to his primary assistants, Venturo Mazza and Antonio Vivarini, but the overwhelming mass of material was left to his brother, Ambrogio, who was a scientist. Ambrogio would eventually sell to Leopoldo de' Medici, again explaining the large group of drawings in the Uffizi, including this sheet. At least some of Mazza's drawings seem to have wound up in the collection of Crozat and probably include the group in the Louvre. But the most amazing footnote in this history of dispersal concerns the drawings that Barocci gave to Vivarini. These remained in the house of Vivarini's family in Urbino, where astonishingly, August Schmarso still found some hanging on the wall when he went to Urbino before writing his book on Baroque in 1911. Further evidence falls in line with this pattern. Armanini notes that Prino Vaga's daughter sold her father's works to a Mantuan merchant, and we learn from other sources that this occurred around 1555, about a decade after Prino's death, and then the Mantuan merchant was the antiquary Jacopo Strada. Strada was a voracious collector, and he seems to have realized how to work the system of buying from an artist's heirs when there was no later painter in the family. He also bought some of Giulio Romano's drawings from the artist's son, a purchase that included not only Giulio's sheets, but also those that Raphael had given to his pupil. And yet, Strada cannot have bought everything that Giulio left behind, for Rubens also managed to buy a notable group of Giulio's drawings during his own period in Mantua, long after the deaths of both Giulio and Strada. Strada, furthermore, had left Mantua long before, having moved to Vienna in 1556. So Rubens must have bought up the remnants of the studio from a later generation. Strada returned to Venice in 1568, and that's when Titian painted the famous portrait. Strada was there in Venice, though, in an unsuccessful attempt to acquire the previously mentioned Vendramin collection for Duke Albrecht of Bavaria. We can talk about general patterns, but there are, of course, exceptions to every rule. Despite Guercino's notable stinginess, for example, and the desire of his immediate heirs Benedetto and Cesare to keep the drawings together, many of his works made it out of the Casa Gennari before the 18th century. Christina of Sweden, for example, was able to acquire a decent group, probably during her visit to the artist near the end of his life. These are the sheets today in the Tyler's Museum. Other Guercino drawings that were subsequently in the English collections of Sir Peter Lely and the Dukes of Devonshire were probably sold to them by Benedetto Gennari during the latter's time working in England. Still others were acquired by Giulio Cesare Malvasia, probably from the Gennari family, while Malvasia was writing his life of Guercino. Annibale Carracci provides a similar example. The enormous collection of Carracci drawings in the Royal Collection at Windsor represents the remnants of his studio, and we have an unbroken line of provenance. Annibale left these to Domenichino, who in turn left them to his assistant Francesco Raspantino. They were bought from Raspantino by Carlo Maratti, who sold them to Pope Clement XI, from whom they were acquired for the Royal Library. Not surprisingly, for a group of drawings that were the remnants of the workshop, this group includes sheets not only by Annibale himself, but also by his assistants in the large Roman projects. Thus, for example, there remain, in addition to the drawings by Annibale for the Farnese ceiling, which you see here, there remain among the so-called Annibale drawings sheets probably by Domenichino, Albani, Lanfranco, and others. Here are a pair of sheets by Annibale and Lanfranco, both for the Herrera Chapel in San Giacomo degli Spagnoli, and both still cataloged as by Annibale at Windsor even today. One can imagine the studies for a given project being gathered together at the end of work, regardless of which artist had made them, and passing down through history together. And yet, if the workshop remnants all went to Domenichino, there were hundreds of other Carracci drawings that had already left the studio. Even during Annibale's lifetime, there was a group that had been acquired by the Bonfiglioli family of Bologna. It's tempting to think that these were drawings from Annibale's early years, left behind when he moved to Rome. They too, however, were later acquired by Joseph Smith, and from there entered the Royal Collection, where they were integrated with the ex-Albani drawings, so there's no way to be sure which came from which source. Again, the Bolognese biographer and historian Malvasia also managed to acquire a large group of drawings, although I suspect these were somehow extracted from the Bonfiglioli holdings in Bologna. And in Rome, Francesco Angeloni, a friend of the artist, was also said to have 600 drawings. These were studied by his nephew and heir, another one of the scholars, Giovan Pietro Bellori, who was meant to inherit them, although after Angeloni's death they were dispersed, with a large group going to France with Nicolas Mignard and eventually finding their way into the collections of Crozat, Mariette, and the Louvre. With mention of these scholars, Malvasia and Bellori and others, we come to a key moment in the history of drawing collecting, one in which the historians take over. There are relatively few of these in the 16th century, with Vasari and Gaddi serving as the notable exceptions. It seems that Vasari's Libro dei Disegni went first to Duke Francesco de' Medici, and that Gaddi then bought or received it from the Duke. It had no inherent value as part of the Medici collections. Yet by the 17th century, a distinctly different pattern emerges, with scholars collecting for themselves, but also overseeing the princely and ducal collections. The case seems to be more than one of very rich aristocrats simply buying up everything that was available. Indeed, there was a paradigm shift of sorts in which any sort of drawing, sketches as well as more finished drawings, works by minor artists in addition to the great masters, had newly understood value. The two key figures here are Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici and his advisor Filippo Baldinucci. Leopoldo acquired the collection of Niccolò Gaddi and the core of Vasari's Libro dei Disegni as part of it, and set out to continue what they had begun. He employed a network of agents across Italy. We've already encountered them in this talk, buying remnants of Tintoretto's workshop from Cassero, Barocci's from his brother Ambrogio. In a letter to one of his correspondents, Bernardo della Penna, Leopoldo explained that he would always take drawings of the great masters, already having a great collection of these, but that he was also interested in the others, those not of the best class or from an earlier age, for he had few examples of those. His collecting practices were acknowledged to be a novelty, one he had to explain to his agents. In addition to Baldinucci in Florence, Leopoldo's agents included Malvasia in Bologna, Marco Boschini in Venice, and many others. And one can imagine how his own collection would have been perceived and emulated by those who became historians and collectors themselves. Leopoldo's drawings become the core of the Uffizi collection, the greatest single resource for Italian drawings. But Baldinucci himself formed a collection of some 1,200 sheets, arranged chronologically in 4 volumes, although ironically these eventually passed not into the Uffizi, but rather into the Louvre, which acquired the albums in Florence in 1806. Long before that time, though, the Louvre collections had acquired a similar flavor of the historical collection, thanks in no small part to the influence of later historians like Marciari. The pattern of artists trying to hold on to their working drawings would continue into the 18th century. One thinks of the Tiepolo family organizing their drawings in albums by type, but by that time there were few collectors who hesitated to buy whatever sort of sheet was available. There would always be, perhaps there will always be, collectors who only prefer the big pictorial sheets that were prized by the earliest collectors. But the scholarly approach to drawing collection had prevailed. The workshop remnants were eagerly pursued, and the working drawing had become collector's treasure. Thank you.